So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with, I'll ask each speaker 2 questions. They're going to be as brief as they can. Then we're going to hand the microphones over to you for any questions you may have. And we have further backup questions that we'll cover if you don't have much to ask. So we'll do it starting with Andrew. Andrew, well, first, by way of introduction, I don't know which hemisphere I should respond to you with. My right loves your paper, holistically. But my left hemisphere suggests 2 criticisms. If your paper is correct, then my left is wrong and my right is right, meaning that I should have only praise for your paper. We'll move on to Bethany. No. Andrew, you invite us to an interesting speculation at the end, and I'd like to invite you to do that theoretical speculation out loud for us. You write toward the end, quote, "It strikes me that a more explicit treatment and/or comparison of Whitehead's characterizations of the primordial and consequent natures in relation to those of the right and left hemispheres might yield new insights." It's a fascinating invitation for reflection, adventure of ideas, and I wonder if you'd just take a minute or so to kind of see where that's taken you so far.
Yeah, that's a great question. It will be short because I think part of the reason for naming that was to say this is an adventurous thought for further research. So there's no simple mapping of the right and left hemisphere on the primordial and consequent nature. It's simply not possible. But I wanted to, see if there might be some interesting resonances as a thought experiment to connect the dual nature of human brains to the dual nature, primordial and consequent nature of Whitehead's God. So I think I'm not sure if I have concrete ways of comparing those just yet, and I have been thinking about that. So, but that is a stimulus, I think, for further research. You're not just using your left hemisphere and asking me questions, of course, right? Or just merely the right. So one thing that Gilchrist always says is these are always at play in everything that we do. People critique him. Well, you use your left hemisphere to write your book. Yes. Right? You're using both of them in a deep sense. So it's not an appeal dualistically to one or the other, nor I would say would we do that with Whitehead's primordial and consequent nature. We'd look at the ways in which they're both required in some significant way, having a different function. So, nice. Thank you.
Yeah. That's why it was an opening joke and not an opening criticism. All right. So in each case I want to invite the author to something and then ask a criticism and how they think about it. So with regard to the second, is there a causal relationship between the nature of God, or at least the idea of God, and the structure of our brain? It seems to me there are 3 possibilities. First, the left and right hemispheres might be the way they are because God made it so. Second, it might be that we think of ultimate reality as panentheistic and process because that's how our brain is structured. Or finally, third, there might be no causal relationship. It just happens that our brain is structured in such a way that it gives us an accurate understanding of God by coincidence, as it were, even though there's no causal relationship between God and the brain structure. And your brain probably recognizes that each of those would bring some difficulties for your position, except maybe the first, but it doesn't sound very processy. So God made us have hemispheres in this way. God compelled it to be so. Maybe we just think of ultimate reality as panentheistic in process because our brains are structured that way, or there's no causal relationship whatsoever. It's a sheer coincidence that the 2 match.
There's no simple short answer to that, but that is a good question. I think we'd have to get into a much deeper metaphysical discussion. As I indicated at the end of the paper, it's an interesting question as to whether we might see the emergence of right and left hemisphere as a manifestation of a dual theory of perception, which would be getting us into the way in which every actual entity...
Go into a little bit, I remember that. Go into that a little bit more. Tell them what you mean by that.
The way in which Whitehead conceives perception essentially is a mode of feeling, right? There is a much wider and far more inclusive mode of feeling and perception that is non-sensory. And this is a mode of feeling that extends all the way down in nature. Now, in human experience, of course, we have I made a connection to the left hemisphere. Consciousness conscious perception allows us to limit what we're focusing on. It narrows in a way that's allowing us to focus. But it, for Whitehead at least, is the top of, or an iceberg tip of a much more fundamental pre-sensory mode of perception. So I'm not sure if we can make that comparison between a dual theory of perception and the physical manifestation of the brain.
Could it have caused evolution to work in that way toward our brain?
Well, that's what I was suggesting in saying that might be an interesting hypothesis. Again, requiring more research, though, certainly.
But it's a causal hypothesis, so we could test it in some ways.
The dual hemispheres would presuppose some metaphysical conditions or states that is relevant to them. Then it would be a question about those states in some way.
Thank you, Andrew. 2 questions for Bethany. First, an invitation. The argument you've offered challenges some of the standard assumptions in the divine action debate. I sense that underlying your approach is a different way of relating to academic disciplines in general. I'd like to invite you to explore that difference. So how might your Pentecostal process Thomist approach lead you to relate to philosophy or maybe to the social sciences in some different ways than we often see in process thought or indeed in the science and religion debate in general?
Thank you. I think that often when we talk about the different disciplines and the different sciences, we tend to give the upper hand to one of them in order to keep consistency across all of them. And I think I'm probably a lot less worried about doing that, of saying, well, actually, this all has to work with consistency in this one methodology, and I'm happier to work amongst different methodologies in sort of a pragmatist way, which might just be deeply inconsistent. But I sort of think about, if you tried to deal with biology the way that you deal with particle physics, you're going to be in trouble. And if you try and do the same in psychology, that's problematic as well. And so I think allowing a more fluid methodology as we approach these things might offer a way forward.
And aren't there some philosophers of science who would very much resonate with what you're saying? Can you just tell them a little bit about who might?
So I was thinking of Nancy Cartwright, for
me
example.
Too.
Yeah.
Just tell them a little bit about that.
Her book, The Dappled World, basically says, we typically assume philosophically that underlying all of these differences we see between quantum worlds and the larger classical world where things work, by Einsteinian principles, et cetera, that there's an underlying reality there that will inform and make consistent everything we find inconsistent. And what she says is, no, the world is like a patchwork quilt. You've got these completely different things that butt up against each other at various points, but there's not an underlying material that would suddenly make the whole thing uniform. What we have is this world made up of bits and pieces that are all quite appropriately dealt with in completely different ways.
And some major people in science and religion have drawn from that. Keith Ward, Nancy Murphy have drawn from Nancy Cartwright's work. So there's a kind of school that you are implicitly representing in the paper, I think. You have a number of allies. Last question. You rethink the relationship of science and religion in some interesting ways. Let's explore just one. Could an action of God be detected by a scientist in principle? And so here's why I think that might be possible. Let's accept your view, quote, that the reason for divine action is primarily to lead people towards Christ-likeness. And, as you correctly note, quote, the amount of what happens in the world that's actually being scrutinized in any particularly rigorous way by science is minute. God could interrupt the regular causal relations in 10,000 ways in this room right now. Watch out. And neither science nor indeed we would notice. So could a miracle, in your sense of the word, be detected by a scientist in principle, or would you say that God would only perform miracles to lead us toward Christ-likeness when they can't be detected by science?
As briefly as possible, yes, it could be detected.
Yeah.
But a little longer, it wouldn't be repeatable. So you'd never be able to find a mechanism that would make that happen every time. So, just as I can lift my iPad, right? In theory, God could also lift my iPad and cause it to fly up to the rafters. There's no reason, but in principle, with my view of the theory, God could make that happen. And if we had sensors all around it that were watching it, what they would just see is that it was acting in that way, but they wouldn't find a causal action for it. That's the idea of the Thomist one, that the secondary effect happens without a secondary cause to cause it. So, we would just see this wonderful anomaly, and because it's not repeated, and because it's not happening within the usual causal relations of the world, we'd just say, well, that happened. But we wouldn't need a rigorous science to do that. We'd just need all of us watching.
Yeah. I could imagine a scientist at the lab late at night seeking Christ, and something happens which just couldn't have happened, and that God has used that in a way that helps bring him or her to...
Yeah, and it's interesting, because a lot of the arguments against miracles are based on the fact of, well, we don't see them anymore, right? Hume's argument. We don't see them, therefore they couldn't have happened. But somebody like Craig Keener has done a huge amount of work documenting modern-day miracles where you've got the before, you've got the after, and you've got no causal explanation for what happens in between. And so I think that sort of an argument, by analogy, is just not as strong as we think it is.
Thanks. And finally, Darren, I really enjoyed your paper and spent a lot of time looking into the science behind it. So you were self-deprecating, but there are serious arguments in, these are serious positions in contemporary physics. So first, just a yes or no warm-up question to draw the audience in, because we'll probably alienate them in a moment.
All right.
Many people are fascinated by these online discussions with ChatGPT, right? Which is already transforming education and other sectors in major ways. ChatGPT processes data using 10,000 NVIDIA A100 processors. They cost $25,000 each. You can do the math. On your view, would ChatGPT meet the physical conditions for being conscious?
Well, that's how I made my paper. So you tell me. You all bought it? There you
Great
go.
answer.
No, it wasn't that good. I did make it. So.
Yes or no, though?
I mean,
Seriously.
That you're asking, will it or has it already?
Because you're interested in physical conditions for consciousness arising. So I just thought I'd take an example that everyone would know.
I mean, I don't think it's there yet. No.
Okay.
But yeah, I think so. I think eventually that's going to be the case.
So would we need more NVIDIA A100 processors?
Yes, a few more. I mean, eventually you get
So
to a
I didn't
certain
say for
level.
God to arise. We'll get to that question next. But just for consciousness to arise. Do we really need that much?
Not on, it's again, on the integrated information theory, we need far less.
Yeah.
I mean, far less. So, I mean, it depends
And
on...
you
which-
affirm the integrated information theory in your paper.
So on that viewpoint, then absolutely it's going to qualify,
Okay.
for sure.
So in your view, we should say
It's
that...
it's panpsychist, you're almost right.
No, because not the physics side.
IIT, the integrated information.
Yeah.
theory. Almost everything has some degree of a pan-experientialist or something, at least.
It's more complicated than that. Okay, we'll come back to that. So first question, you say, this is an open invitation, you say something resembling a God, in quotes, can arise. And I'm interested, what are the sufficient conditions for an emergent phenomenon to, quote, resemble a God or, quote, be a godlike entity?
Be more advanced than us. I mean, even on the Samuel Alexander old viewpoint on like finite gods, I mean, it seems like that's how...
So that's not his position. In the second volume of Space-Time and Deity, he says that it's all consciousness together which creates the, is it seventh or eighth emergent level, which is the level of deity. So it isn't anything like an IIT.
No, I'm not saying it's like IIT. I'm saying that it's just that if you're asking like in terms of what are the sufficient conditions for this emergent...
Yeah, so you use a term, it's very central to your paper, something resembling a god can arise, or be a godlike entity can arise. Samuel Alexander, I don't think, gives you the evidence that you need for that. So I just want to know, it's a definitional question, what are the sufficient conditions for something to resemble a god, or be a god, well, be a godlike entity for you? I'm just trying to understand the word God in your paper.
Yeah, so here's, I guess, a weird way to answer that and look at this, is that if you were, and tie in all of it, since I was talking about there being maybe multiple, right, universes that have come and gone in cycles, if you have a Boltzmann brain that's created sort of in the way I suggested, and then it is there able to somehow experience or witness, whatever that means, the creation of even other random things, those could function in some ways almost as like forms for the future, that it would want to recreate these things. So I think having a goal like that is critical, and then having some set of, right?
Okay. Let's move on to science. I do think your paper is going to need first a specification of what makes something conscious. That's my next question. And then what makes something a godlike entity. And those can't be identical. Not everything conscious is a godlike entity, I would think. So I love the science. For me, the new science does inspire awe and wonder. Actual empirical science inspires awe and wonder as much as the speculations of the philosophers. So let's slow down and examine brains with an ANES, and then the transmission of information across universes. So I agree that, as you said to the audience a moment ago, a local increase in complexity could form, quote, a large membrane-like structure similar to today's cerebral organoid mats or nets. But wouldn't it take far more for it to be understood as, quote, a cogitating entity? So we have this reverse of the entropic move, and you get this complex membrane formed in space, it's spherical or whatever, just by coincidence, as it were, truly, highly unlikely, 10 to the 10th to the 10th, right? But to say that's a cogitating entity doesn't follow unless you can tell us something more about it that would make it automatically a cogitating entity.
You're totally right. And all of this was just wild, right, speculation in terms of, if I could answer these questions, for one thing, I'd have tenure. I would have tenure. So, in fact, you'd all be coming to my conference if I answered what is consciousness, what is, so, I mean, you're right. I mean, I don't know exactly where I'd place like the threshold or the definition.
So I think there's a theory of cognition where you could say that the arising of a membrane-like structure would be sufficient. Okay, the last one, your argument does require, quote, the hypothetical possibility of some information or even a conscious memory bank crossing over from one cycle of a universe to a new universe. Later you say, all that matters in this paper is whether some amount and type of information could cross over, and it seems that maybe some could. At the end of the paper, when you're talking about causation across eons, you're still writing, if it is possible. So let's just find out if it's possible. Let's presuppose multiverse theory is correct. Basic laws of physics, however, are different in different universes. So it would seem that even gravitational waves from one could not have causal effects on another. We had John Cobb and some others who were here did a conference some years ago where Alex Vilinkin, one of the originators of multiverse theory, was present. And I also had the privilege of working with Andre Linde further back. So they and Hugh Effort also deny causal influence because the laws are different. And we could talk about how they do say that multiverse works. And Roger Penrose, at least a few decades ago, held the same thing. So I'm not even clear how gravitational waves from a universe with laws of set 1 could have impact in a new universe with physical laws of set 2.
Neither am I. All I was getting out of it from my research was that somehow it could affect, like what we see in the CMB, the cosmic microwave background radiation, these irregularities, which are going to allow for, like I was saying, kind of almost like nucleation type sites for some structures to come about. I mean, it was very vague, all the stuff that the little that was there that I looked into, and that's all that I could basically glean from that. I mean, certainly though, for the multiverse stuff, you mentioned Hugh Everett and all, I mean, not everyone buys into the many worlds, right? interpretation of the quantum scenario. So, I mean, who's to say that he's right? Right?
Okay, thanks.
He did pretty much quit right after his PhD in terms of physics and cosmology.
Yeah.
So,
We have till 11:30, or we end at 11. We should stay on schedule. So I want to give a chance for 2 or 3 people in the audience to raise a question, and I think there's somebody with a microphone, or how are you going to do it?
Sherry, would you mind grabbing the mics, the free mic there, front row, turning it on? We're live streaming, so please make sure you speak into the mic. Thank you, Sherry.
And Sherry, third row on the right. Sherry, oh. Okay.
Oh, I understand that physicalism is dependent upon, well, presumes causal closure of the physical, and further that such causal closure of the physical is set in the context of the logic of actualization, of logic of the actual, of Boolean logic, and that from that presupposition in terms of, say, physicalism, then we take contemporary science and certain developments in cosmology, and then people get into, from that, multiverses and other kinds of discussions. And it strikes me that, speaking as a physicist, all this is most interesting, and you get into these speculations of multiverses upon other things to extreme complication, and by that initial commitment to such Boolean description, a limitation of logic at the most fundamental philosophical level and logical level, that here one has led to what I'm reading almost as being a satire on multiverses. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. Professor Godehard Bruntrup, and welcome, Godehard. We studied together in Germany many years ago.
Many years ago. It doesn't seem to follow from IIT that ChatGPT is conscious, because according to IIT, he can always build a machine that acts perfectly as it were conscious, but isn't. If the process of information is not integrated, but just linear. So you could build a machine that perfectly passes the Turing test, which is basically ChatGPT. And even though it perfectly passes the Turing test, it would not be conscious. That's an entailment of IIT. So it's perfectly possible that the machine we are using to produce the ChatGPT-3 are not conscious at all, and that's perfectly consistent with IIT.
Do you know the answer?
I didn't hear a question.
So,
I agree with him.
but no, the programming of ChatGPT-3 is sufficient, recursive enough, that it passes the requirements of IIT, I would say. Okay.
He said causally.
Seems like, Phillip, you know a lot more than I do about that.
Well, I'm being told by the organizer that we should take the last question and then move to the break, and I see a woman toward the back.
Thank you. I think this question might be for Bethany, but if any of you feel called to answer it. You were talking about the responsibility that God has to the particulars, and there was a mention in the next talk about the possibility of a sleeping God that is partially asleep and is waking up. And I was wondering how much room you have in your system for a God that is waking up to its responsibility to the human, that doesn't necessarily always know it. But throughout time and development and our participation, it comes to recognize it.
Wow, that's a wonderful question, and not one that I've ever considered before. But given the idea that God experiences the universe temporally, and God is surprised by new things coming about within the ranges of possibility, then I think that there would be a learning process as God interacts for the very first time with a new entity. So whether that's, you know, you and I, or the very first human, or the very first, living organism. So I do think that there is a sense of growing and a sense of risk where even knowing all, loving all, there's still room for, you know, especially when you start thinking about multiple possibilities, that there's A, B, C, D, and each of them could be good in one way and bad in another way. There's going to be a continual working out of how to actually enact the purposes God has for creation. So I think we, again, just as we sort of usually optimize, there's a universal underlying theory, we also usually think, well, there's one way that is actually the best way. And I don't know that that's true. And so I don't know, I mean, in one sense, I just don't know enough to answer your question, but I could imagine that there is a sense of exploration. I'm trying to avoid saying trial and error because that seems a little too haphazard, but a sense of exploration within God's action. Thank you.
Your papers were a fantastic way to launch the conference. Please join me in thanking our three panelists.
Thank you.